I never imagined that a simple trip could turn into one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. It was a chilly night, and I had just finished attending a family event in a neighboring town. The event had run late, and by the time I decided to leave, it was well past 9 p.m. Everyone urged me to stay the night, but I insisted on going home. I had work the next morning, and my small rented apartment wasn't too far, just a 2-hour drive. I remember stepping into my old car, a second-hand Toyota Camry that had seen better days. The engine coughed to life, and as I pulled out of the driveway, I reassured myself that everything would be fine. The highway stretched ahead of me, quiet and dark, with only the occasional flicker of headlights from oncoming vehicles. For the first 30 minutes, the drive was uneventful. The stars twinkled faintly above, and the cool breeze slipped through the slightly cracked window. But as I approached a more remote stretch of the highway, something began to feel off. It started with the headlights in my rearview mirror. A black SUV had appeared behind me, its headlights glaring bright. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle heading the same way, but the way it stuck close to my car felt odd. Every time I sped up, it did the same. If I slowed down, it followed suit. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was just being cautious, but deep down, my instincts whispered otherwise. About 15 minutes later, I decided to test my theory. I deliberately took an exit that led to a quieter, more isolated road, one I knew wouldn't have much traffic at that hour. To my dismay, the SUV followed. Now I was truly unsettled. My heart pounded harder with each passing second. The road was deserted, with no streetlights and only the faint moonlight illuminating the way. I rolled down my window, hoping the fresh air would calm me, but it didn't help. I debated whether to call someone, but the patchy network in that area made my phone almost useless. I tried dialing a friend, but the call dropped after a few rings. I was on my own. Then the SUV began flashing its headlights. It wasn't a signal asking me to stop. It felt more like a taunt. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I pushed my car to go faster, the engine groaning in protest. Just when I thought I was doomed, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was a small roadside shop, the kind where truck drivers stop to grab a meal or rest. Relief flooded through me as I slowed down and pulled into the lot. The SUV sped past me, its taillights disappearing into the darkness ahead. I sat in my car for a moment, my breathing shallow and quick. The shop was dimly lit, with a few tired-looking men sitting outside, sipping tea. I got out and approached the counter, ordering a bottle of water. The shopkeeper, an older man with kind eyes, noticed my trembling hands. "Everything all right?" he asked. I hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, just a long drive." He didn't press further, but I could tell he didn't believe me. After a few minutes, I decided to continue my journey. The thought of staying there all night didn't feel right either. As I got back into my car, I noticed something chilling. The SUV was parked further down the road, barely visible in the darkness. It was waiting for me. Fear gripped me like never before, but I knew I couldn't stay put. I started the car and drove past the SUV, pretending not to notice it. Almost immediately, its headlights came on, and it began to follow me again. This time, the situation escalated. The SUV got closer, almost bumping into my rear bumper. I swerved slightly to the right, trying to put some distance between us, but the driver was relentless. I remembered a trick my dad once told me about dealing with aggressive drivers. He said if you're ever being followed, drive towards a police checkpoint or a well-lit area. Thankfully, I knew there was a checkpoint a few kilometers ahead, and I clung to that hope like a lifeline. The next few minutes were pure chaos. The SUV tried overtaking me, swerving dangerously close to my car. At one point, I thought it would run me off the road. My hands were sweaty and my legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of the police checkpoint up ahead. I honked my horn repeatedly, signaling for help. As I approached the officers, the SUV suddenly veered off the road and disappeared into the night. The policemen waved me down, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. I quickly explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a rush. They listened attentively, nodding now and then. One of them even offered me water while the others radioed nearby patrols to keep an eye out for the SUV. They advised me to stay at the checkpoint for a while to calm down before continuing my journey. I sat in my car, staring into the darkness, my mind replaying the events of the night. Who was in that SUV? What did they want? I'll never know, but one thing was certain: I'd never take night drives for granted again. By the time I got home, it was almost dawn. I parked my car, stumbled into my apartment, and collapsed onto the bed, my body and mind utterly drained. That night taught me a lot about trusting my instincts and the importance of staying safe. If I hadn't stopped at that roadside shop or headed towards the checkpoint, who knows how the story would have ended. Even now, every time I drive at night, I remember that eerie feeling of being followed, the relentless SUV, and the overwhelming relief of seeing those flashing lights. It's a memory I wouldn't wish on anyone. If this is your first time coming across our channel, welcome. We share amazing stories that will keep you entertained and coming back for more. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on our latest uploads. And if you're enjoying this story, give us a like to let us know. It really helps the channel grow and reach more viewers like you. Thank you for your support. It all started on a cold Friday night in late November. My partner Lisa and I had been fighting all week, but that night, everything came to a head. The argument started over something small, a missed anniversary dinner. But the real issue wasn't the dinner, it was everything that had been building up for months. My long work hours, her feeling neglected, and me thinking she didn't appreciate how hard I worked. Words flew sharp and cutting. "I'm not just some paycheck," I shouted. "And I'm not a shadow in your life," she snapped back. The way she said it, raw and broken, hit me, but instead of calming down, I felt the heat rise in my chest. I grabbed my keys and stormed out. "I need air," I growled over my shoulder. Her voice followed me out the door. "Don't walk away from this." But I did. The night drive. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the urge to get away. The streets were eerily quiet as I drove out of town, headlights carving tunnels through the fog. My mind replayed the fight over and over, each memory tightening the knot of anger in my chest. I thought of all the things I should have said but didn't, and I cursed myself for the ones I did. At some point, I found myself on a lonely back road, surrounded by nothing but endless pine trees. The radio played faintly, some old rock song that only made the night feel heavier. I was lost in thought, and before I realized it, I had driven nearly an hour from home. When I saw the dim glow of a roadside bar, I pulled in. I told myself it was just for a quick drink to calm my nerves. But deep down, I knew I wasn't planning to stop at one. The bar. The place was old and worn, with faded signs and a jukebox that hummed faintly in the corner. A few locals sat at the bar, but they barely glanced up as I walked in. I sat down, ordered whiskey, and let the burn numb the edge of my anger. Drink after drink, the world around me softened. I didn't think about Lisa, the fight, or the consequences. It was just me, the whiskey, and the dim glow of the bar. That's when a random lady appeared. She sat 2 stools away, wearing a deep red dress that looked out of place in a rundown bar like this. Her hair was long and dark, cascading over her shoulders, and her eyes had this strange pull, like they were looking straight through me. "You look like someone trying to escape," she said, her voice smooth and low. I laughed bitterly. "Something like that." She moved closer, her lips curling into a smile. "Sometimes running isn't enough. You need something stronger." I don't know why, but I let her words sink into me. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was the way she seemed to understand me without asking. Or maybe it was just my anger and frustration clouding my judgment. Whatever it was, I didn't push her away when she suggested we take the conversation somewhere quieter. I don't remember leaving the bar, but I remember the road. She was in my passenger seat, giving me directions to her place. Her voice was steady, almost hypnotic, and I followed without question. The further we drove, the darker the road became. The trees grew thicker, leaning over the road like shadows ready to pounce. "Almost there," she said, her voice suddenly colder. When we reached a clearing, she told me to stop. I looked around. There was no house, no lights, just an empty stretch of dirt surrounded by trees. "This doesn't feel right," I muttered. She turned to me, and for the first time I really saw her. Her face had changed. Her eyes were no longer alluring but hollow and dark, like pits leading to nowhere. Her smile stretched too wide, revealing sharp teeth that didn't belong to any human. "You wanted to escape," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. I tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. My heart pounded as she leaned closer, her cold breath on my neck. "You thought you could run from your guilt, didn't you?" The car door slammed open on its own, and I was dragged out by something unseen. The ground beneath me felt like it was moving, pulling me down. She stood over me, her laughter sharp and piercing as shadows swirled around her. "Lisa," I whispered, regret filling me like the cold night air. "Lisa can't save you," she said. "You chose this road." I don't know how I escaped. I woke up hours later, lying in the dirt by my car. My clothes were torn and my body felt like I'd been through a war. The woman, or whatever she was gone. The road was silent, but the air still carried a sense of wrongness, like the world had shifted just slightly off its axis. I drove home in a daze, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I got to the house, Lisa was waiting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She didn't ask where I'd been or why I looked the way I did. She just stared at me, her silence heavier than any words. I broke down, telling her everything, not about the woman but about how I'd let my anger drive me away, how I'd failed to handle things like an adult. Looking back, I realize how close I came to losing everything, not just Lisa but myself. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Anger is a dangerous fuel, and the roads it leads you down can take you places you may never return from. If you ever find yourself in an argument with someone you love, stop and think before letting anger take the wheel. No fight is worth losing yourself, or the person who matters most. Sometimes stepping away isn't about running, it's about finding your way back. It all started on a quiet Thursday night. My wife, who was 7 months pregnant, woke me up around 10:30 p.m. Her cravings had gotten the best of her again, and this time she wanted pickles and peanut butter, of all things. I didn't have them at home, and honestly, there was no way I could tell her to wait till morning. You know how it is with pregnant women. Once the craving hits, there's no arguing. I quickly grabbed my car keys and headed out. The nearest grocery store didn't have what she wanted, so I had to drive to a neighboring town, about 30 minutes away. The roads were quiet, almost eerily so. It wasn't my first late-night drive, so I didn't think much of it. By the time I found the pickles and peanut butter and checked out, it was already close to midnight. I texted her to let her know I was on my way back, and she replied with a heart emoji. That little message made me smile as I started the journey home. I decided to take a shortcut through an old back road I'd driven a few times during the day. It would shave off 15 minutes, and I wanted to get home before she fell asleep. But as soon as I turned onto that narrow, unlit road, I felt a strange unease. The trees on both sides seemed to close in, and the only sound was the hum of my car engine. I brushed it off, blaming it on my imagination and the late hour. About halfway down the road, my headlights caught something ahead. A car parked sideways, blocking the lane. My heart skipped a beat. The car was empty, and its hazard lights weren't on. It didn't look like an accident. I slowed down but kept a distance, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw movement in the trees to my right. Shadows. Several of them. I froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Out of nowhere, 3 men stepped into the road, their faces partially covered with bandanas. One of them held what looked like a crowbar. My stomach dropped. They didn't look like they needed help. They looked like trouble. "Get out of the car," one of them shouted, banging the crowbar against his palm. My mind raced. Should I step out and try to talk to them? Should I reverse and risk one of them jumping on the car? My gut screamed at me to act fast. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse, flooring the pedal. The tires screeched as I sped backward, the men yelling and running toward me. Then I remembered the side road I'd passed about a minute earlier. I prayed it wasn't a dead end. As soon as I reached it, I turned sharply, the car skidding slightly. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The road twisted and turned, and I had no idea where it would take me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Eventually, the trees thinned out, and I found myself on the main highway. I didn't slow down until I was several miles away. I pulled over at a well-lit gas station to catch my breath. My hands were shaking and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I looked at the bag of pickles and peanut butter on the passenger seat and almost laughed. Almost. When I finally got home, it was past 1 a.m. My wife was waiting by the door, her face a mix of worry and relief. I didn't tell her the full story right then. I didn't want to scare her. I just handed her the snacks, kissed her forehead, and promised myself I'd never take that shortcut again. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. I could have been robbed, or worse. If there's one thing I learned that night, it's this: never ignore your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Stick to well-lit, busy roads, no matter how late it is or how much of a hurry you're in. And most importantly, no craving is worth risking your life over. Stay safe out there. I never thought driving at night could be so terrifying, but that was before this happened to me. It was a cold autumn night, the kind where the wind whistles through the trees, and the road stretches endlessly into darkness. I had just finished visiting my parents in a small town in upstate New York. The visit had run longer than I planned, and now I was paying the price. The road ahead was deserted. Just me, my old Honda, and miles of pitch-black highway. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from my car's weak headlights. They flickered once, just for a moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The air inside the car felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired. I turned on the radio to keep me awake, but all I got was static. Every single station. That's when I noticed the sign. It came out of nowhere, glowing faintly in the darkness. Route 66 detour ahead. I didn't remember any detours on this route. I had driven it dozens of times. But the road was blocked ahead, and there was no choice but to follow the detour sign. The detour led me onto a narrow, winding road that I'd never seen before. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and I had to slow down to a crawl. That's when I saw it, something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing in the middle of the road, his back to me. He wasn't moving. I slammed on the brakes and honked the horn. Nothing. The man didn't even flinch. I rolled down my window a crack and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. Something about him felt wrong. His clothes were tattered and his head hung low like he couldn't lift it. I had a gut feeling I should just drive around him, but before I could, he turned around. His face. I'll never forget his face. It was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow like black holes. His mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should, and he let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but something worse. It was low and guttural like a growl, and it shook me to my core. I panicked and hit the gas, swerving around him. As I passed, he reached out and slammed his hand against my window. The glass didn't break, but the sound of it made me jump. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and he was gone. Just gone. My heart was racing as I sped down the road, the narrow path twisting and turning. The trees seemed closer now, almost suffocating. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same man. Standing in the middle of the road again. It wasn't possible. I had just left him behind. But there he was, staring at me with those hollow eyes. This time I didn't stop. I hit the gas and drove straight toward him, but as I got closer, he vanished into thin air. I was shaking now, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road seemed endless, and my GPS had stopped working. The detour wasn't on the map, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't find my way back to the main highway. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, filling the car. It was like a dozen voices all speaking at once, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I turned off the radio, but the whispers didn't stop. I screamed, "Leave me alone." The whispers stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I was alone in the car. I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I pressed the gas pedal as far as it would go, the engine roaring as I sped down the road. And then the road ended. There was no warning, no sign, just a sheer drop into darkness. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop inches from the edge. My heart was in my throat as I stared into the abyss. Behind me, the whispers started again. I turned around and my blood froze. The back seat wasn't empty anymore. He was there. The man with the hollow eyes sitting in my car, grinning at me with that impossibly wide mouth. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because when I woke up, it was morning. My car was parked on the side of the highway, right where the detour had started. There was no sign of the narrow road, no trees closing in, and no man with hollow eyes. But there was something on the window. A handprint. I sold my car the next day. I couldn't bring myself to drive it again. Even now, I can still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. And I'll never ever take a detour again.